Hello, in this video we'll be reviewing the Shores of Sahti DLC, the new characters Sigrun and Bernard, and patch 1.5. Two caveats before we jump in. Number one, spoilers. I'll be talking about a lot of content in the new DLC. And number two, my review is through the lens of high madness. We'll be covering high impact balance changes, new keywords, Sigrun, Bernard, the Shores of Sahti Act, new cards, and a new game mode. So first things first, I said I was reviewing through the lens of high madness. That obviously means M16. At least it used to. We now have Madness 18. For Madness 18, there is an additional modifier called Equalizer. This modifier says that all thermometer combat rewards are equalized to great in the performance reward at the end of combat. As a reminder, the thermometer combat rewards are excellent, great, good, satisfactory, poor, and underwhelming, and they determine the gold, the XP, and the card rewards that you get offered. So before, if you would have gotten excellent, you'll now get great, but similarly, if you would have got good, satisfactory, poor, or underwhelming, then they will be normalized to great. And if you would have got great, then you still get great. This has a couple of big impacts. Number one, I think that Madness 17 is actually easier than Madness 16 for the large majority of players, because before, if you were getting good, satisfactory, poor, or underwhelming, you'll now be snowballing on XP and gold, just as you would have been if you had been getting great. This is obviously amazing for kind of off-meta, slower comps, things like Thorns, tankier comps that would have otherwise got poor or underwhelming in most fights. You now get your gold and XP equivalent to a fairly fast comp. Conversely, if you're a tryhard like myself and you're trying to shoot for excellent in every single fight, then this modifier actually makes the game a little bit harder than M16 because you're not snowballing gold and XP as hard. And then the third thing to mention, this does not impact score. So you can see here the score impact from excellent, for example, it says +5 points, great is +3 points, good is +2 points. This only normalizes the in-game rewards. So if you are trying to set score, then you still have to get excellent to impact the score. So that's the modifier for M17. But what about the base madness increase for M18? You are reading that correctly. Injuries are permanent and they cannot be removed. They cannot be removed in town. They cannot be removed in a campsite. They cannot be removed with a card reward remove from a corruptor, for example. Remove 2 cards from your deck and they are stuck in your deck. So if you accumulate Death's Door or 2 early, it's going to be really, really difficult to finish the run. If you go into the hatch and get Broken Bones, they are there forever. If you fight the farmer and you get low self-esteem, it is there forever. So I think this is really punitive, more for kind of casual players that are playing off meta, being stuck with those curses. I think Death's Door in particular, if you get a Death's Door or 2 in the early game, it's going to be really, really difficult to finish the run at that point. I'm nervously excited to see how this one pans out. Very, very tough. Next, we'll talk about nerfs. There are 3 sets of nerfs that I found noteworthy. Number 1, duality. I think this is absolutely justified. If you remember on Lyre and Navalia, I think 4 free energy a turn on a 2-card ball character is probably a little bit strong. So they have been nerfed to 3 times proccing instead of 4. But the 4th proc has been moved to a level 5 ability, same is true for Navalia. So you can see here for Lyre, for example, if you want the 4th proc of duality, you go Beacon of Light, and in the end game you still get 4 procs. Like I said, I think this is totally justified. It was very, very strong. Nerf number 2, Powerful. If you've watched any of my videos, you'll know I always take on the carry. Powerful increases damage by 10%, but you lose 3 charges max, so you could still do 70% multiplier with 7 stacks of Powerful. That's changing now to 8%, and you lose 2 maximum charges. So your theoretical cap is 64 instead of 70, and you need an extra stack. So in the early game, if you were getting, say, 7 Powerful before, and you're getting 7 now, it would be 56% damage multiplier instead of 70. That's a big drop-off. For aggressive OTK comps, this was an absolute must-take, and I still think it is, despite being hit pretty hard. And then nerf number 3. On cards with 2 or more damage instances, if they're the same damage type, or converted to the same type, for example with Volcanic Axe, only 1 value will be shown on the card, the damages will be unified. Now, why is this a nerf? Well, before, if you look at Shatter, you're doing 2 damage instances and therefore you double dip buffs and debuffs. So if you have Bless, the Bless applies on both instances of damage. If you have Mark or Wet on the enemies, then they will apply to both instances of damage. Now, this may not sound like a big deal, but you can see here on the screenshot on the left, this is on the old patch, when Shatter had 2 separate damage instances, had a bunch of Bless, full powerful on the carry, and was doing 1600 close to damage, double dipping on the buffs and debuffs. Here's a screenshot from the new patch, and bear in mind that the powerful nerf is also in effect here, but unifying the damage instances, you can see it's a fairly big drop off in damage, still a lot of damage, 1,000 versus 1,600, but it's not an insignificant nerf. So who are the casualties? There are 3 buckets. The first one's the obvious one, and there are many examples of this, but I've listed just a couple here. Shatter. Shatter was pretty broken, to be honest, in the old patch, so I can kind of understand why Shatter might need to be reined in just a little bit. Second is a Fiery Shield on Cornelius, for example. That's his class card. That obviously gets a nerf. Ice Barrier gives block, but it unifies the block in the same instances. There are actually a lot of cards in the game with X+X damage types, so I haven't listed them all out here. Second is Transform in conjunction with any card that has 2 different damage types. So think like Recurring Nightmare or Book of Nightmares or Carnage. If you're transforming those now with Volcanic Axe, they will not double dip from Bless anymore. And third, and most obviously, this is a slight nerf to the status effects. Bless is marginally weaker, Mark is marginally weaker, Wet and Crack. Net, I think that unifying the damage instances is more intuitive, especially for newer players. Seeing 2 different damage instances was kind of strange. And I still think these strategies will be viable. Yes, they take a hit, but Transform is still going to be really, really good. It does create some interesting outcomes. So Pummel is actually better than Carnage when transforming damage, because it's an extra repeat, whereas obviously before Carnage you'd get 6 separate damaged instances, but now you'll only get 3. So we talked about nerfs, but what about buffs? Well, there are a few buffs to some very, very expensive cards, which in all honesty, I'm probably still not going to use in Hive Madness, but some pretty cool ones nonetheless. Ice Comet, for example, which is craftable in town, you can upgrade it to Mythic subsequently, now puts a Shatter into your hand. So it is going to be a normal Shatter. So if you had like Vampiric Tutor or a way to discount this, or you're playing Amelia and you're going on the left-hand side, this can become somewhat interesting with things like Dimensional Crystal, Le Spell Echo, but it is very, very expensive. Similarly here, you can see buffs for Meteor Shower, Mesmeric Mirage, and now Neurotoxin. There is actually an AoE version based on the poison, which is pretty cool. Again, super expensive, both in terms of cost and shard-wise, but I think for casual players, these will be really nice quality of life changes. There were a lot of small tweaks and buffs to cards that I would have otherwise considered not viable in Hive Madness, and to be honest, I still don't think they're viable in Hive Madness, so I'm not going to cover all of those tweaks in this video. Okay, next topic is new keywords, and the first one is Rust. We have a lot to unpack here. Firstly, it increases the effect of Crack, Poison, and Slow by 50%. It reduces the effect of Fast, Sharp, and Wet by 50%. If it's on the enemy, then you prevent 1 reinforce per charge, and then a Rust gets removed when it happens. It also removes reinforce from the target completely when applied, similar to when Wet is applied to Burn, for example. And you remove 1 charge at the end of the turn. Now, just in case that's not enough things to remember, there's more. Rust is a completely unique curse in that normal debuffs and curses are dispelled on a FIFO basis. For the non-accountants, that means first in, first out. And what I mean by that is as you kind of dispel or use up curses as you go, they go down the chain. So if you get vulnerable, for example, it will start on the very right-hand side of the chain. And then if you get slow, it will go to the right-hand side of vulnerable, and you're kind of dispelling, mass dispel as you go, and they accumulate from right to left. But Rust is different. Rust stays at the back. So if you get vulnerable after Rust, Rust will always be at the back. The reason it does this is because it increases the effect of poison, and so it'd feel really bad on the enemies. If Rust finishes before poison, you won't get the benefit of the poison increase by 50%. So my understanding is the intention is Rust always stays at the back so that it expires after poison, so you don't miss out on the poison increase. So there's very weird nuance that Rust, if it's on your characters and you accumulate more and more curses, it's very hard to dispel. Unless you can dispel absolutely every curse from the character, then it's always going to be in there because it won't kind of progress down the chain from right to left, if that makes sense. And then the other thing to remember is that it also affects perks. So for example, there's a perk that says Wet on enemy reduces lightning resistance, or Wet increases cold damage, or Rust reduces the effect of Wet by 50%, including these perks. So it would be 0.5% resistance reduction per charge, for example, in the case of the first perk here. Similarly, Rust increases the effect of poison by 50%. So if you're having shadow resistance by 0.3% per charge perk, for example, that will get increased by 50%. Rust features in Bernard's kit, so I'll talk about it a little bit more later. The next new keyword, which you may have spotted earlier on Neurotoxin, is Flask. Here are some examples of cards that are assigned the Flask type in the scout pool. Interestingly, Revealing Flask, the yellow one, used to be a small weapon, and you used to be able to get it with wide sleeves on Thulz, for example, and on Gustav, and it felt really bad because it doesn't do damage. Revealing Flask is now no longer a small weapon, is my understanding, which is a kind of buff to wide sleeves, in my opinion. Similarly, in the healer card pool, there are some flasks here too, including a new one, Holy Water. I'll touch on the new cards later, but Dilute, Detoxify are flasks, Panacea, Vargas are all flasks too. Again, flasks are a feature of Bernard's kit, so I'll touch on them a bit more later. So on to the next topic, the new characters, the most exciting thing. We have Sigrun and Bernard, and we'll start with Sigrun. When I first heard that Sigrun was going to be the new character, my initial reaction was PTSD from God of War, getting absolutely destroyed by the last Valkyrie. Well, Sigrun was strong in that game, and she is in this one too. Firstly, as context, Sigrun is a dual-class character. She's both a scout and a mage, with access to 2 card pools, which is inherently very, very good. So let's start with her passive, War Maiden. At the start of your turn, gain 1 powerful. If you have stanza 2, you get 2 powerful, and with stanza 3, you get 3. I think this is a great passive. Powerful is always fantastic. Even despite the nerf to the perk, I still think it's great. Let's start with her left-hand side abilities. At level 2, you get a copy of Storm Channeler shuffled into your deck, and as you can see, it transforms damage to lightning. I think this is really fun, despite the slight nerf to transform. Still think it's great. And you can see, when you play the next 4 attacks, you do an AoE lightning and spark to all monsters. Note that once you've played those 4 attacks, then the Storm Channeler buff falls off, and you go back to doing the original damage types that you were doing. So there is a world where maybe you just want to play 3 and then keep it on forever by using spells instead of attacks, for example. I think this is a fantastic ability. Being able to do an AoE when you play an attack for free is awesome. At level 3, Sigrun gets Scout Duality, which is very similar to the dualities on Lyra and Navalia, and just like those two on the current patch, it procs 3 times a turn. So when you play a Scout card, reduce the cost of the highest cost Mage card, and vice versa. You get 3 procs of that a turn. At level 4, you get Thor's Might shuffled into your deck, which increases lightning damage by +5, and then for your next 3 attacks, you'll get 2 powerful and get a copy of Corrupted Thunderbolt put into your hand that costs 0. This obviously pairs very nicely with Storm Channeler, and if you are trying to keep Storm Channeler around, like I said, you want to play 3 attacks, and Thor's Might requires 3 attacks, so it synergizes really nicely. The level 5 Valhalla is ridiculous. You get a free power coil, basically, increasing the max charges by +8 on all of your heroes, plus, not only is that ridiculous, but you can activate Scout Duality for a 4th time. Amazing level 5. What about the right-hand side? At level 2, you get Magic Rune, which is nice status, and you get to draw a card whenever you play spells, procs 3 times. At level 3, you get Spellsinger, where whenever you play a song, you can put a random elemental spell, fire, cold, or lightning, of the same cost of that song, but +1, and then it becomes free. So if you played, say, Song of Celerity, you'd get a 2-cost elemental spell, but it would be free. This only procs 1 time a turn. At level 4, you get Odin's Wisdom, and for the next 2 spells, you'll gain an energy, gain 2 powerful and 2 bless, which is benefited by perks, by the way, but it does increase the cost of all song spells in your hand by 1, which you may actually want if you have Spellsinger. At level 5, you get Ragnarok, where you can gain the Spellsinger's trait, but if you already had it, then it can be activated twice per turn, and the base cost of the free spell is increased by 2 if you have stanza 2, and 3 if you have stanza 3. Sigrun's kit is awesome, but what is equally, if not more impressive, is her starting item, Winged Helmet, which goes in the armor slot. It gives 10 block and 1 fast, which is even more potent because Sigrun is absolutely rapid with a base speed of 17. So if you've perked speed up to 20 and fast, you'll get 2 charges of fast, and you'll be straight out of Act 1 with a base speed of 24 at the start of fights, which is even faster than Andrin. What does her starting deck look like? She has 4 Thunderbolts, which is a new lightning spell, 3 Captivating Voice, 3 Charged Lunge, which is a new melee attack with Chain 1, 2 Rain, an Ode of War, a Storm Javelin, and her card is Wings of Heaven, so you can dispel elemental statuses, gain and energize a stanza, and heal for 10. Really cool starting deck in my opinion. Well, how can you build Sigrun? And if there's one thing we've learned from Lyra and Navalia, hybrid characters are very flexible. Let's go over some examples. So if you've watched any of my videos, you'll know that I love to play Andrin as the speed controller. For aggressive OTK comps, Andrin is an absolute must. Well, Sigrun can do that too. Here's an example deck in Act 1. Now, I'm not saying that she's better than Andrin. Losing Expert Tracker is a really big deal, and to some extent Wild Hunt too. But the fact that it's viable is really interesting. You can play Bookworm instead of Chant of Initiative, for example. You get access to Transmission, which is great, Inspire and Energize. Now, Revealing Flask, I wouldn't spend the shards for it, but if it did crop up in a Divination, I'd probably take it as a very poor man's Expert Tracker, but certainly I wouldn't spend the shards for it. Now, in these flex slots, you could play Dark Ritual. She starts off with block, don't forget, from Winged Helmet, so if you perk a couple of block, she won't damage herself with Dark Ritual. Similarly, Chant of Accuracy, Captivating Voice, Shock Nova, Frost Nova, Rain, depending on your comp, take your pick. This is what she might look like in the same role in the late game. Honestly, not much changes. You add Equivalent Exchange, Scroll of Intellect for obvious reasons, Mana Gem, and then something like Book of Nightmares. And then your team benefits from the insane passive of Valhalla, getting a team-wide power coil. Interestingly enough, because she goes first, I would actually consider maybe playing Tome of Intellect on her as well, granting 1 Inspire to the other 3 characters. Shuffling Scroll of Intellect in their deck, I think is pretty good value. Like I said, I think ultimately Andrin probably is still better in this role, but the fact that it's possible is really cool. She can also play a support character in a very similar comp. This is the classic hybrid good stuff soup. Just get the best cards from 2 card pools and you're golden. Here's what the Act 1 game might look like in that scenario. Same flex slots as before. And similarly, here's what the end game might look like in that slot as a support. Again, just abusing Scout Duality and Valhalla. One of the big benefits of playing Sigrun in the support role is you have Winged Helmet, so she doesn't necessarily need to be the beneficiary of speed control from Andrin because she's just so fast herself in the first place. Again, completely viable. I think that maybe Navalia and the resist reduction that you get from Defiled Legacy might be better in this role, but it's really interesting that Sigrun can do this too. Build number 3 is Cold Support. Here's what the early game looks like. She has 2 Rains already in her deck, so you could obviously go up to 4 Rains, throw in a Frost Nova, and play again in that 3rd slot, and support a cold carry like Emilia or Evelyn, for example. What's nice about this in the Rains is that if you go the right-hand side Magic Rune, you get a draw 3 for 1 energy, which is a pretty decent rate. And then in the late game, you can do the classic Blizzard Cold Snap shenanigans, and she's very good, extremely consistent. Just the addition of Deflect, Setup, and Scavenge, you can see there in the bottom left, as well as Adrenaline, to any card pool is fantastic. So we've talked about her as speed controller and support, but what about carry? Well, she can do that too, and it's really helped by the fact that her passive gives her powerful at the start of every turn. Here's an example deck coming out of the Act 1 town. If you don't have enough powerful, maybe consider adding in an unstable power. Of course, as you go down the left-hand side, once we hit level 2, definitely be adding Storm Channeler to the deck. Now, we're obviously just theory crafting here, but with the nerf to Shatter, I actually think that Fire is quite viable on her as well. In Act 1, Fire is pretty good, obviously not in Hatch, but by then you will be transforming at level 2 anyway with Storm Channeler. But the fact that you can transform these spells with Storm Channeler to Lightning, Fire Blast is free, Ember Storm is a 1-cost AoE, and Living Flame is a 3-cost jump 3 plus 50%, that is a great rate in terms of energy return, and you can just transform them to Lightning anyway. Here's an example of what the late game might look like with a similar deck. And again, if we're trying to keep our damage transformed with Storm Channeler, maybe you want to Blade Flurry twice and Slice once, get your 3 procs of Thor's Might, the next 3 attacks, but keep Storm Channeler, and play something like Recurring Nightmare. Even though it is nerfed with the transform, I still think it's a great rate for what you're getting. We might even consider Bull Lightning, which got a slight buff as a lightning spell. And in the hallway fights, I would definitely play Superconductor, which is great damage for the energy cost. Another really interesting trade-off is Thor's Might versus Odin's Wisdom. Initially, you might just think, yeah, Thor's Might plus 5 damage to lightning, I'm transforming to lightning, and I get my free Thunderbolts when I play attacks. But Odin's Wisdom, if you've perked Bless, and perked Bless does 1.5 increased damage, but no longer increases healing received, that would be 6 Bless, which equates to 9 damage increase versus the 5 from Thor's Might. Additionally, Odin's Wisdom is free and generates 2 energy, whereas Thor's Might costs 1. So you could argue that Odin's Wisdom is plus 3 energy, but you're trading off no free Thunderbolts. Now let's say, for example, you're able to get off an Icicle Barrage. Compared to Thunderbolts, I actually think it's a pretty good rate, and so it's somewhat comparable, plus 9 versus plus 5. I could see myself going either way. between Thor's Might and Odin's Wisdom. Similarly, we don't have to transform. We could just go kind of conventional spell. Sigrun, play Magic Rune, get draw 3, which is fantastic value for 1 energy, and just kind of mix and match the abilities down the right and left hand side. This flexibility just makes for a fantastic character. There are so many ways that you can play her, and I'm really excited. So not only can she speed control, support, and carry, but she's also a hell of a tank. Don't forget, with Winged Helmet, she'll start off combat with 19 block and a bunch of fast, so you'll be able to get off your defense spells before the enemies go, most likely, and protect the team. And in Caltrops, scouts have an incredibly cost-efficient defense that you can get in Act 1. In fact, between Deflect, Scroll of Defense, Stone Skin, and Mana Shield, there's just really, really good cost-efficient defenses that can be played. And you can toss in a Feint as well, which can be free. If I was playing her tank, I would perk Evasion for things like Blur and Mirror Images, where you just dodge attacks, which is great in High Madness because attacks hit really hard. And in the same vein, in the late game, you get access to Ballad of Evasion, which is arguably the best defensive card in the game, as well as things like Disengage, Parry, Mirror Images, Equivalent Exchange. Just fantastic all around. And then lastly, build number 6, Spellsinger. If I was playing Spellsinger, this is how I would do it. I would still go Storm Channeler on the left, convert damage to lightning, and then use things like Reverberant Verse and Vexing Crescendo to transform the damage to lightning. And then that also mitigates the fact that with Spellsinger, you might get like an off elemental type of spell where I didn't want fire, or I didn't want ice, or I didn't want lightning, for example. Storm Challenge would just make everything lightning, so it kind of mitigates that downside. I think Spellsinger is a really fun ability, and a lot of casual players will really enjoy it. If I'm really tryharding and min-maxing at High Madness, I'm never ever going to take this. Scout Duality is just so good, and Valhalla, the power coil that you get, is just unbelievable. So I'm putting it here. If I was forced to play it, this is how I would do it. I'm not likely going to play it. So that's Sigrun, unbelievable character. What about Bernard? Well, just like Sigrun, Bernard is a multi-class hero. He's a scout and a healer. His passive is Hermit. At the start of your turn, apply 1 poison and 1 rust to a random enemy. Let's cover the left-hand side abilities. At level 2, we get Healing Flasks, where the next 4 flasks, the lowest HP hero recovers 20% HP, you get 2 Vitality and 2 Regeneration. At level 3, you get Healer Duality, which operates exactly the same way as the other dualities. Level 4 is Ancient Shell, where you get a huge resistance buff on yourself, plus 30%, additional buffer charges of +1, and then the next 5 skills, all heroes gain 8 shield, 4 regenerate, 1 mitigate, but you suffer 1 rust on every hero. Now, despite the rust, this is a huge amount of defense, and if you're careful, you can actually buffer it before your characters suffer from the rust too. However, you might not want to do that. You might want to keep the rust around, because the level 5 Philosopher's Stone is at the end of your turn, grant 2 Bless and 2 Vitality to all heroes, plus an additional for each rust charge on you. And this level 5 allows Healer Duality to be procced for a 4th time. Now, if you do have a fair amount of rust on yourself, you can actually apply a ton of Bless, even in the base case, granting 2 Bless and 2 Vitality, which will be increased by perks, so 3 of each if you've perked accordingly. That is a lot of buffs on your team. For the right-hand side, the level 2 is Saltwater, where for every energy used, apply 4 poison and 3 wet and 1 rust to a random monster that can be procced 4 times on flasks only. The level 3 is Corrosion, where you get an additional rust charge, and then at the end of your turn, apply 1 poison to all monsters for each wet on them, and apply 1 vulnerable for each rust on them. For level 4, you get a copy of Dark Tide, where you get additional dark and wet charges, and then the next 4 skill, you're doing an AoE of shadow damage, dark and wet to every enemy. And then the level 5 Alcest is absolutely ridiculous. Just like Sigrun has her power coil, Bernard has his own nullifier. You get poison +2, rust +1, vulnerable +1, but what I'm really looking at is vulnerable on monsters have +8 maximum charge. That is a huge amount of resist reduction. Very, very strong level 5 ability. So what is his starting item? It's Longevity Potion. This just gives him a bit of sustain, where if he's damaged by others less than 40%, he recovers 18 HP and gets Vitality once every fight. Now, we talked about how fast Sigrun is. Bernard, on the other hand, he's pretty slow. He has a base speed of 8. So with perks, you're going to get to 11. But yeah, he's a slow boy. It's a very, very big price to pay. Super, super slow. What about his starting deck? He has 4 of the new flasks, Oxidant, 3 Vile Gas, which is also a flask, Toxic Rain ×2, Uproot ×2, Detoxify ×2, a Panacea, and his card Quick Concoction, which lets you discover 3 flasks and place 1 into your hand, cost reduced by 1, and can actually high roll quite a lot in the early game. I think it's a pretty good starting deck net. Toxic Rain is good value, Detox is always great, Panacea is going to be welcome in Act 1 where we really need dispels, and then obviously 2 Uproot is really, really good. Now, even with the benefit of Rust, I still think that at High Madness, Poison is going to be a pretty lackluster strategy in comparison to other things he could be doing. And then not only that, but Bernard, because he's so slow, he's going to go at the very, very end, unless you do a lot of speed controlling. And so Poison, it goes at the end of enemy's turn. So you'll lose turn 1 if this is your damage source, because they're going to go ahead. You'll apply Poison. They'll still get their turn 2, and then they'll suffer Poison at the end of turn 2. So I think the tempo is just really, really low. So to be honest, I'm probably not going to be playing him as Poison if I'm really, really tryharding. It's doable. You can do anything on M16, 17, and 18. But I don't think it's good, even with the benefit of Rust. So I'll most likely be playing him as a kind of a hybrid good stuff support, just cherry picking the best cards from 2 card pools and supporting the other characters. And the 2 card pools that he has access to are incredible. Look at what you can get here. Clarity, Expected Prophecy, Scry, Trace, Uproot, Detox, Delay, Deflect, Setup, Scavenge, and Benediction, just as an example for the early game with a few options here. Very, very strong with Healer Duality and Alcahest. You will have to speed control significantly. A base speed of 8 up to 11 is a huge penalty, and maybe just because the overlapping card pools are so good, that's one of the reasons why he is so slow in the first place. Here's what that deck might look like in the late game, and spoiler, Amplify, I'll be talking about that in a little bit, but he should be able to get your characters to like 50 Bless on turn 1 if he's quick enough, and then obviously having Alcahest as additional support on your team to increase max vulnerable charges is absolutely bonkers. I think if you are playing a wet-based comp, then having Dark Tide is not necessarily bad, just to have a blitz way of getting a lot of wet on the enemies too, especially if you have the card draw to do it. I do think if you are so inclined, you can play him as a traditional healer in the early game. Great card pools again, and you can proc Healing Flasks with Detox. Dilute is a flask, there's a lot of bleed in Act 1, so Detox and Dilute will be really, really helpful. Panacea is obviously a flask, and you could just go with like Prayer of Healing, Package, Benediction, heal a team a bunch and play him as a traditional healer. There's a lot of options coming out the gate of Act 1. You can play Healing Rain, you could play a Sweet Melody if you have good stanza uptime. Just a lot of potential. You could also just switch out for Uproots, for example. So instead of having the Deflect, Setup, Scavenge package, which is very shard intensive, he already has 2 Uproots. You could perk Invulnerable, add a 3rd Uproot. It's a good option. And then here's what that healer build might look like in the late game. Again, Prayer of Healing I just think is a fantastic rate. You've got Ancient Shell for utility, Healing Flasks, Mass Dispel. He obviously gets all his discounts from Healer Duality. Can be a strong healer. And then if you have the perks for it, like I mentioned earlier on Sigrun, Ballad of Evasion, best defensive card in the game, you can play that on him too. Now, while I do think Alcahest is really strong, you can see on the right-hand side of I think +8 vulnerable charges is really good. Philosopher's Stone is definitely a consideration as well if you're playing Ancient Shell. There's a lot of Bless, a lot of Vitality, so it really depends on the comp. What are you trying to get access to? Do you want the resist reduction, or is the Bless and the Vitality better for you? So look, if I was really tryharding at High Madness, I think these 2 builds are the options I would go for. I would do a carry. I'm sure it's possible to play him as a carry, and I'm sure it's possible to do Poison. Like, would I recommend it for pushing High Madness? Not really. That's fine. That's fine. I think he's going to have a lot of utility in Lower Madness, and people have a ton of fun with him. So with that in mind, let's move on to the new zone, Sahti. I love the aesthetic. I think it looks great. And there's also a ton of flexibility in the pathing. You can kind of mix and match a lot of nodes in Sahti. This is what the above ground looks like. You can see there's a rift that doesn't always roll. Obviously the nodes will chop and change depending on what you roll. There are a few little side zones and subzones, but there is a main subzone, which I'm showing on screen now, until you get to the final boss. And so all roads kind of lead to the final boss underground here. So what can you do in Sahti? A couple of cool things to watch out for. Most notably, by far the coolest thing is Mjolnir. Mjolnir is a really strong weapon, all damage +3. Whenever you play a melee attack, draw 1, deal 7 lightning and 3 spark to a random monster. And Corrupted is even more ridiculous. Instead of doing it to a random monster, it becomes an AoE to all monsters. Very, very strong. So how do we get Mjolnir? Well, unfortunately it is chance-based. You're not guaranteed to get it every one, but there are 3 ways to get it. Method 1 is you have to roll a rift. You can see here I'm kind of circling in the middle of the screen. You have to have Sigrun in the team. And then you head to Crater Island, which you can see in the top left. I've circled it in red. And you have to take Sigrun's event at Crater Island. Then you take the rift down, fight the Kraken, and then Mjolnir will be a reward once you come out the other side of that fight. Method 2, exactly the same thing, but if you don't have Sigrun in your team, then there's a roll, so you either have to get 4 or lower, and then you take the Rift, fight the Kraken, and Mjolnir will be your reward. If you don't get the Rift, then you have to have Sigrun in the team to get Mjolnir. And you can take any node you like to fight the Kraken, and then after you fight the Kraken, there'll be a check on a card where if it's a melee attack specifically on Sigrun, then you'll get Mjolnir, so it is chance-based. There are some other really cool things, including the pets. So you can see here, Matey, he casts Peck at the start of the turn. It targets the back monster, and it does 3 pierce, and you can repeat 1. And so it's very cheap. I think it's like 156 gold in Act 1 town, and paying 156 gold for guaranteed 2 damaged instances on the carry, I think is phenomenal value. You can play this with Pierce, you can play this with benefits from Bless, you can play with Transform. I think it's excellent, excellent rate. You can find Matey at this node here. It has to be the green one, and you can see I'm just circling it on the screen. Next notable pet, Mimey. Now, I'm not looking so much at the card it's casting, Castling. Oh, that was a mouthful. I'm looking at the passive. 5% discount in Magic Forge, altars, and item shops. Now, in Act 1 Town, this costs 348 gold, but then obviously any gold outside of divinations is not cheaper. You get a discount on gold, get a discount on shards. And I personally think this is a must take. It accumulates so much value over the course of the run. And even in Act 1 alone, if I'm spending 3,000 or 4,000 shards, which I often do, I would happily pay 348 gold for a 5% discount, which equates to, say, 150 to 200 shards. I'm happy with that rate. 348 gold to 200 shards. That's a good rate, in my opinion. And that's just in Act 1. It then subsequently, every act beyond that is just incremental value on all the gold that you spend on items and all the shards. So yes, if you're perking resource heavy, which I often tend to do, I think this is amazing value. And for me personally, I think it's a must buy in every Madness 18 run. For context, here's what the upgraded version does. I'd probably put this on other candidates, but just in case you're curious. Now, to get Mimey, you have to head up here. There's a little sub-zone that you're going to go through this kind of sunken boat. And you'll see on the very, very top, there's a few things you have to do on the way, but there's this node here that says, let's try to befriend the chest, and 300 gold should do the work. You have to roll a 4 or higher. As you can see, that's where you get Mimey. Next really impactful pet is Jelly. Now, even though it's expensive, Jelly offers very, very good sustain. You can take +3 Sanctify charges in the perks on literally any character, put Jelly on that character, and it's going to apply 4 Sanctify every turn to all enemies. And even though on High Madness you're penalized with 25% less healing, it's still a bunch of sustain. So for example, I've been putting this on Andrin, giving him +3 Sanctify, literally nothing else, applying all that Sanctify to the enemies. And then on the carry, I could play Blood Rage, Fanaticism, Life Tap, and just heal up just with the Jelly procs without penalty by playing these cards. It's really, really good in my opinion, and don't sleep on it. If you are doing that, just be wary of Fanaticism come kind of Act 2 onwards. It's going to probably deal too much damage to yourself, but certainly Blood Rage and Life Tap should be able to get a really decent amount of sustain from Jelly and play these cards. Now, I believe Jelly is a default pet. I don't think you have to unlock it. Sorry if that's a mistake. And so those are 3 really impactful pets. And then lastly, there's Enki. Unfortunately, I don't think Enki is anywhere near as strong as the other 3, but just showing it just in case you're curious. Now, obviously, there's a bunch of cool things that you can do in Sahti, so I won't list all of them, but a couple on the list are corrupt jewelry, and you can corrupt armor, just like you can in Feyborg, where you can corrupt the weapon at the Rat King. You can corrupt jewelry and armor, which is really cool. And it wouldn't be a pirate-themed zone if you couldn't access the Straw Hat quest. So I'm not gonna give everything away, but if you side with the correct beard at this fight, you'll have access to the Straw Hat quest line. Now, when I say side with the correct beard, I'm talking about these guys. I'm not gonna lie, these guys are horrendous. They have a base speed of 21, and they each have their own flavor of a card like this. So if you see, for example, Captain's Presence, what it does is it casts on all heroes, and then for 1 turn only, every attack in your hand is going to be increased the cost by 2 until discarded. Here you can see another version which increases the cost of all skills in your hand by 2 until discarded. Similarly, a version where all spells in your hand are increased by 2. And so they go across the 3 of them, each casting 1 flavor of this thing. And not only that, but they each also have a version which can increase the cost of all cards, regardless of type, in your hand by 1 until discarded. So in High Madness, is extremely difficult. So punitive of the resource reduction. So fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, this isn't the only node where you encounter these guys. They can actually be champion units. As you can see here on the left, this guy can appear in hallway fights as a champion unit. But not only that, if you look in the third row here, they can also appear as normal units too. And as a normal unit, this guy can cast Captain's Presence. It increases the cost of every card in your hand by 1 until discarded on every hero for a full turn. And they can play it on back-to-back turns, which is just absolutely back-breaking, in my opinion, having tested a little bit. So we'll see how long this stays for. I think this is the strongest normal enemy unit card in the game by a significant margin. Against the Archon, you suffer from fatigue. This is much worse than fatigue, in my opinion. But luckily, that's the extent of which you have to deal with this mechanic until you reach the final boss, where he does the same thing, but increases the cost of all cards in your hand by 2 until discarded. And again, there are times where he can play this on back-to-back turns, and you feel like you get 1 or less casts per character. It's absolutely brutal. Otherwise, I think the boss fight is really cool. He has this pet eel, which he kind of attacks to sustain himself, which is pretty brutal. This is a cool fight. This King's Presence thing, oh my god, it's so tough. This fight reminds me a lot of the Hydra in Aquafall. You're going to need a lot of Dispel to keep your team alive. It's a slog, that's for sure. Now, here are some other cool items to watch out for in Sahti. I think Powder Cask being added to the pool is really get when you play a fire spell, just get an AoE for free. I think it's great value. Jolly Roger's a cool one, although it is a bit chance-based. Sextant's fantastic, you get a free scry every turn. And then the small chest is 30% discount. I'm sure a lot of players are really going to enjoy that. Now, I mentioned Jolly Roger, that it is chance-based. If you are able to corrupt it, then it gives all heroes +3 Fury and an Inspire every time you play a melee attack, which is obviously then great value if you can corrupt it. So obviously there are a bunch more things in Sahti. These were the ones that stood out to me. So let's talk about new cards, starting with my favorite, Amplify. I think Amplify is a fantastic card. Firstly, it's a much needed dispel that targets silence specifically, which is, any of you know, that can be pretty prevalent where you're playing a mage carry and you just permanently silence. So that's really nice. But more importantly, you can target it at a hero, or in the case of yellow, you can actually target anyone to increase aura charges by a multiplier or curse charges by a multiplier. I personally really like the blue version, where if you're buffing the carry, this could be a huge amount of value. Note that it rounds up, so for example, if you had 3 Energize and 3 Inspire on a carry, then increasing those aura charges by 50% will actually take you to 5 charges of each, because it's 1.5 rounded up, which already is really good. So if you're playing something like Divine Power, and you have this to finish off the end of the turn, so you have 15 or 20 Bless, 3 Energy, 3 Inspire, this would be 2 Energize, 2 Inspire, and like 10 to 15 Bless for 3 cost, which is crazy value. So for me, Amplify is definitely the most exciting one. I'm going to zip through the others, some of which we've already seen in this video. Charge Lunge, 2 instances of damage for 1 energy. Compassion, where you can share your vitality with 1 other hero. For me, this is kind of meh. If it was all heroes or something like that, I think it would have been interesting, but I think it's a little bit underwhelming, in my opinion. You have Evaporate, which dispels wet off enemies and replaces that with Burn and does fire damage based on the wet dispelled. Similarly, Holy Water, which deals damage based on the target's wet and gives you Bless. I actually think the yellow version of Holy Water is a really good rate. You can give another hero, including yourself, 3 Bless, which obviously increases to 4 if you've perked Bless. And then you yourself gain 2, which obviously increases to 3 if you've perked Bless. That's a really good rate. Even ignore the heal. There's a very good rate of Bless per energy. And then you have Oxidant, which we looked at earlier. I think it's pretty expensive, to be honest, for what you get. I'm conscious you could put the blue one on Bernard for his level 5 to try and increase the Bless charges on the team. But notably, there is no AoE Rust applier outside of Bernard's level 3, but in terms of an actual card, it's all single target Rust. You have Thorn Eater, which maybe could be used as tech against Ylmir, but we already have Uproot. So this is kind of interesting to me. It's not something that I'm going to play, but I'm sure folks will use it. And we've already touched on Thunderbolt, which is in Sigrun's deck, and you get it from her level 4 on the left-hand side. And so those are the new cards. Like I said, I think Amplify is a really interesting new card. I'm looking forward to playing with this one the most. And then lastly, we have the new game mode, Singularity. It's kind of like Commander, Singleton, EDH, whatever you want to call it, in Magic the Gathering, but for across the Obelisk. So you can only have one copy of any card, and in town they're free, but they're not upgraded. So upgrade rewards are much more common, and altar upgrades are limited. You can't do infinite number of upgrades. Divinations are disabled, and you cannot upgrade in town. So it is an interesting game mode. I'll show you here. Here's a screenshot. You can see I'm in town with Lyre. I think the dual class heroes are going to be really good because they have access to 2 card pools. So you can pick and choose all the cards you want, but they're the base upgrade level. You cannot upgrade them, but you will get offered a lot of upgrades throughout the run. And so if you do have, for example, Benediction, and then you find an upgraded one or a corrupted run, you can replace the current Benediction with the upgraded one if you want. You're not like locked in to the lower upgrade versions. You can switch them out, but you can never have 2 copies of Benediction regardless of whether they're blue or yellow or corrupted. So look, we've covered a lot, and let's summarize. The positives. Sigrun, as you can probably tell, is an absolute slam dunk of a character, maybe the best character they've ever done. I think the Sahti aesthetic and theming is top notch. Equalizer is an extremely impactful modifier for the positive, and I think it's a really beneficial addition to the game. There's an absolutely iconic new weapon in the form of Mjolnir, and there's some really nice additions in terms of new cards, some changes to existing ones, and the pets too, especially the pets. I think they're fantastic. Now, in the spirit of being balanced, this is a review after all. I do have a couple of reservations. Firstly, while I do think Bernard is cool, it does kind of feel like a missed opportunity to me. I think there's a little bit of kind of anti-synergy with Wet and Rust in his kit. The poison-based thing at High Madness, it's just not as... He's nowhere near as flexible as Sigrun. I guess it's tough because the bar is Sigrun. She's unbelievable. So maybe in comparison, Bernard feels like a little bit of a missed opportunity to me. Second one is keyword bloat and card pool depth with these keywords. We had Zeal with Lyre, we had Scourge with Navalia, and then there's a couple of cards here and there. The same with Nenukil. There were a few cards that had fast scaling, but not really much depth, and I would love to see kind of more card pool depth built around those mechanics versus a very shallow card pool. And I get a little bit nervous about how many more keywords can you add before it becomes a little bit overwhelming, particularly ones like Rust, where there's like 9 things to remember just on the tooltip, and then 2 things that aren't even on the tooltip, which is that they stays at the back and it affects perks too. I think is a pretty bloated mechanic, if I'm being completely honest. I think one way to keep the game fresh is more perks, please. There were no new perks, which I was a little bit disappointed with this patch, but hopefully there's some on the docket. I know there are some modders in the Discord that are adding perks, but would love to see some more perks added to the game. And then similarly, it's been a long time since the Nenukil release, so there are 8 new cards. I do love Amplify. The other 7, they're kind of... I'm on the fence, but I can understand why other people might play them. But only 8 new cards to the card pool. Would love to see some more cards. To me, the replayability of the game is really reliant on the card pool, just as much as the heroes and the acts. So would love to see some more investment on new cards. I mentioned how much I love Mjolnir, but I'm kind of on the fence that it's RNG. I think that it's my understanding that the Rift in Sahti, I think the chances are like 60 or 80% that it rolls. And if you have Sigrun in your team and the Rift is there, obviously you're guaranteed to get it. But I'm a little bit sad that it's RNG based rather than guaranteed. And partly because in comparison, the other items just feel a tad lackluster to me. When you compare them with Velkrath, with Feyborg, there are so many kind of impactful build-defining items in the other acts, but with Ulmin, the most recent act, and Sahti, outside of Mjolnir, there's no items that really kind of come close to the impact of Velkrath, Feyborg, and Aquafall items, in my opinion. And like I mentioned earlier, the permanent injuries, I'm nervously kind of excited and curious to see how this goes. I'm begrudgingly going to play it, so I'm not going to say I'm going to enjoy it. But, God, this is going to be really, really brutal. And in a similar vein, the King's Presence, especially having a 1 cost increase on just a normal unit, wait till you try it. It feels really, really punitive, especially at High Madness. So maybe this gets tweaked. I don't know. It's pretty overtuned in my opinion. So look, as we covered in this video, I think ultimately there's a ton of new things that I want to try, especially Sigrun, going through Sahti, getting Mjolnir. Really excited about that. I think there are a lot of good changes in the patch. I think it's going to be great value for how much time I'm going to get out of the DLC. And so looking forward to jumping in and doing a couple of videos myself. Hopefully this was a helpful review, and good luck in your Across the Obelisk runs.